Why did the greatest pyramid builders in human history simply stop? For nearly 1,000 years, Egypt raised these massive stone mountains toward the sky, each one more ambitious than the last. Then, almost as if someone flipped a switch, the pyramids stopped rising. No grand announcement, no dramatic final monument, just silence, and empty desert where more pyramids might have stood. What could make an entire civilization abandon the very symbol that defined it? To understand this mystery, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when pyramid building was not just architecture, it was almost a religion in stone. The very first pyramid, the Step Pyramid of Djoser, was built around 2650 BCE. Before this, Egyptian kings were buried in flat rectangular tombs called mastabas. But an architect named Imhotep had a different idea. He stacked 6 mastabas on top of each other, each one smaller than the one below, creating a staircase reaching toward the heavens. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen, and it changed Egypt forever. Imhotep himself became a legend. Centuries after his death, Egyptians worshipped him as a god of wisdom and medicine. Not bad for a man who started out designing a royal tomb. Once the idea took hold, Egyptian rulers could not stop building. Within a few generations, the design evolved from stepped pyramids into smooth-sided true pyramids, culminating in something almost unimaginable, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, it stood over 480 feet tall and remained the tallest human-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. Think about that for a moment. Nothing built by any civilization on the planet surpassed it in height until medieval cathedrals finally did, thousands of years later. The sheer scale of the project still amazes engineers today. The Great Pyramid contains over 2 million limestone and granite blocks, some weighing as much as 9 tons. Workers moved these enormous stones without wheels, without iron tools, and without any machinery we would recognize today. For a long time, popular imagination assumed slaves must have built it under brutal whips. But archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations near the pyramids uncovered worker villages with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities, suggesting the labor force was made up of skilled paid workers, not slaves as once believed. Some historians still debate the exact balance between paid laborers and conscripted farmers during the flood season, but the picture of purely enslaved workers has largely been replaced by something more nuanced. For a while, it seemed like Egypt could keep building bigger and bigger pyramids forever, but cracks, both literal and economic, were already beginning to form. The pyramid of Pharaoh Sneferu, Khufu's father, actually reveals some of the earliest signs of trouble. Sneferu attempted to build a pyramid at Meidum, but it partially collapsed, its outer casing sliding away in a massive stone landslide. Undeterred, he tried again at Dashur, but partway through construction, engineers noticed the structure was becoming unstable, so they changed the angle midway up, creating what we now call the bent pyramid, a strange-looking monument with 2 different slopes. It looked odd, but it survived. Sneferu built yet another pyramid nearby, the Red Pyramid, finally getting the smooth-sided design right. 3 pyramids for 1 king. It is almost hard to imagine the sheer amount of stone, labor, and resources that took. This is where the real story behind the decline begins to take shape. Building pyramids of this magnitude required a level of resource mobilization that few civilizations in history could sustain for long. It demanded enormous amounts of grain to feed workers, timber and rope for construction, skilled engineers, and a centralized government powerful enough to organize it all. Essentially, pyramid building was only possible when Pharaoh's authority and Egypt's economy were both extremely strong. By the time we reach the era after Khufu, something noticeable starts happening. The pyramids get smaller. Khafra's pyramid, though still massive, was slightly shorter than his father's. Menkauri's pyramid, the third of the Great Giza pyramids, was dramatically smaller still, roughly a third of the size of the Great Pyramid. Some historians believe this reflects a genuine shift in priorities, perhaps a growing awareness that resources were becoming stretched thin. Authors argue it may simply reflect each king's individual choices or reign length. Either way, the trend of shrinking monuments continued for generations. Then came a period historians call the Old Kingdom's decline, roughly around 2200 BCE. This is where things start falling apart in a very real, very human way. Egypt experienced a series of extremely low Nile floods, which historians and climate scientists now link to broader climate shifts across the region during this period. The Nile flood was not just important to Egypt, it was everything. It brought the fertile silt that fed Egyptian agriculture, sustaining a population of farmers whose grain surplus supported the massive workforce needed for monument building. When the floods failed year after year, famine followed. Ancient texts from this period describe devastating scenes. One famous inscription speaks of people so desperate that they resorted to unthinkable measures to survive. While some scholars debate how literally to interpret certain dramatic accounts from this era, the broader picture of famine, social breakdown, and economic collapse is well supported by archaeological evidence. With famine spreading and the economy crumbling, the centralized power that made pyramid building possible began to fracture. Provincial governors, called nomarchs, started accumulating more local power and independence as the central government in Memphis weakened. Egypt eventually splintered into competing regional powers during what we now call the First Intermediate Period. Without a strong unified pharaoh commanding resources across the entire kingdom, there simply was no way to organize the massive workforce and grain surplus that pyramid construction required. This is the heart of the real reason pyramid building slowed down and eventually stopped almost entirely. It was not because Egyptians forgot how to build them. It was not because the engineering knowledge disappeared. It was because pyramids were, in many ways, a reflection of centralized royal power and economic abundance. When that power fractured, and resources grew scarce, the pyramids stopped rising along with it. Egypt did eventually reunify under the Middle Kingdom, and pyramid building did continue in some form, though never quite matching the scale and ambition of the Old Kingdom. Later pyramids from this period were often built with mud brick cores instead of solid limestone, making them cheaper and faster to construct, but also far less durable. Many crumbled over the centuries, a quiet symbol of an empire that could no longer commit the same overwhelming resources it once had. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, pharaohs largely abandoned pyramid building altogether, choosing instead to be buried in hidden rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Part of this shift was practical. Pyramids were quite literally giant advertisements announcing exactly where a king's treasure was buried, making them irresistible targets for tomb robbers. Nearly every major pyramid in Egypt was looted at some point, often not long after completion. Hidden valley tombs offered at least the illusion of better security, tucked away in secluded desert cliffs, rather than towering monuments visible for miles. So the pyramids did not stop because the idea failed. They stopped because the very system that made them possible eventually failed. Centralized power, abundant harvests, a stable Nile flood, and a population willing and able to devote enormous labor toward honoring their king, all of these had to align perfectly. And when that alignment broke, even briefly, the age of the Great Pyramids came to an end. What makes this story so compelling is how deeply human it is. This was not a story about lost knowledge or forgotten secrets. It was a story about limits, about how even the mightiest civilizations depend on fragile systems of food, governance, and trust holding together. Egypt's pyramids remain standing today, weathered but defiant against thousands of years of wind, sand, and time. They remind us that even the most extraordinary achievements in human history are built not just from stone, but from the fragile foundations of stability that support them. When that foundation cracks, even mountains of carved limestone eventually stop climbing toward the sky.